The last lecture here for language is going to get a little bit more specific and talk about some areas that I think are really interesting in the area of language and communication. So the first one, this is one of actually my favorite things to teach all semester because I think it's really cool. In-group versus out-group language. So Bernstein, 1973, discussed the differences in verbal codes related to social groups. Again, this started more in the areas of social groups. And what he found was the rich, the wealthy class, tended to speak in more elaborated code, where the language was very precise, all information was disclosed, it was very proper and formal, full grammar was used, whereas those in the lower, poorer classes tended to use a more restricted code, where language is very rigid. And when I say used only in the common vernacular, what I mean is there'd be a lot of slang terms that only those in that class or that social group would understand. Well, obviously, since 1973, this has been taken one step further. And so now we can also put this into example of just different groups that have different terms. So here's an example. Being a sick ripper riding fakie on corduroy is much hipper than to bone air when your edges are toast. And you'd say, huh? Clearly that's restricted code. Now again, we move this beyond social class here, and we're talking about someone who is potentially snowboarding. Being a really good rider going backward on a perfectly good snow is better than to perform a radical maneuver with dull edges. Even that, I'd still kind of say like, huh? But that's a lot more elaborated. Notice there's not a lot of use of the slang and jargon related there to snowboarding. So again, this is a really interesting concept to me, in-group versus out-group language, because even though we're all speaking English, we're all speaking different sort of, you could really call these some of these different dialects of English depending on location. That could be an example of this, or different slang jargon depending on what field we're in. Talk to someone in computer science and you might say, huh, I don't know what you're talking about. But also just this idea of the stereotypes that go back to this social class idea. So if you've ever seen the show Gilmore Girls, and I think this is a great example of it because in the show Gilmore Girls, there's kind of a group there that's very wealthy and rich, and if you listen to their language that they use, it is very precise, very proper. Instead of "I didn't do that," they say I did nothing of the sort." But again, that really follows that stereotype. And then you see the other class, kind of that more middle class to lower class, that would say like, well, I didn't do that. It's just a lot less formal use of language. And while it necessarily isn't, it may be understood, it's still less formal language, and you can see the difference between the two. So that's what Bernstein was really looking at, was that class difference in language. But again, we can really expand this out to much farther than that. So pay attention to that as you go along your days, is to, do you see some of this in-group language and out-group language? And also think about when you're, speaking in front of an audience, or when you're speaking to anyone, are you going to use terms that everyone's going to be able to understand? Or are you using some in-group language? Or are you using a restricted code and maybe not everyone can understand that? Relational meanings, trigger words. Trigger words are language that arouse strong emotion in listeners. Pretty much any word that could be considered a swear word. These words do tend to elicit strong emotions in listeners, and so I would not recommend using trigger words or swear words, for example, in a formal speech. I would not recommend using some other trigger words. The word murder tends to elicit a lot of emotions. Actually, there's a ton of examples, and I think you can probably think of some off the top of your head. But these are really words that you want to avoid unless you're really trying to make a statement. And you'll actually see some politicians will actually use these trigger words on purpose in order to make a statement, and then, it'll be all over the media. Think Paula Deen, not that long ago, used a definite trigger word that elicited strong emotions and actually lost her job from the Food Network. I'm going to talk here, though, about more supportive communication versus defensive communication. Supportive communication language that creates a climate of trust, caring, and acceptance versus language that creates a climate of hostility and mistrust. So a big thing here is I messages versus you messages, and this is one way to do this. In general, you really want to have supportive communication with those around you instead of creating that climate of hostility and mistrust and, not wanting to talk to someone. So, but here's one difference. When you're able to use I instead of you, it's going to sound a lot more supportive. So, for example, and I use this example a lot, you probably see this in email etiquette assignment, when communicating with someone and you're saying, I'm having trouble finding this document you said you were going to post to Angel. Can you direct me in the right place? Notice I'm using that I message. I'm having trouble finding this. Whereas a you message there would be, hey, you forgot to post the study guide. All of a sudden you're accusing the instructor of not posting the study guide. When it comes off as accusatory, that's going to come off as very kind of a defensive communication, because my immediate reaction is, hey, no, I didn't do that. And I'm going to get very defensive. So that's what I'm talking about, the language that kind of creates that climate of hostility and mistrust. And this is really, really, really important, potentially more important when it comes to online or text-based communication, because a lot of misunderstandings occur because of something like this. So think about that as you get into the workplace, a lot of your communication is going to be more electronic, and thinking about trying to use I instead of you whenever possible is going to make your communication so much better.